Hello, and welcome to the Global Journalism Seminar Series at the Reuters Institute. We were always going to talk about Russia this week. We were due to have Anne Simmons, the Moscow bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, join us, but in ways that, are really awful to discuss. The world has changed. A week ago, Vladimir Putin entered Ukraine with a military operation that we soon realized was an invasion. And Ukrainians are right now going through a catastrophe. And our thoughts are with them, and especially with the Ukrainian journalists risking everything to get their stories out to the world. This is a space where information is contested and hard to come by, so it seems especially appropriate that we have with us today the Bulgarian investigative journalist Christo Groshev, who's also executive director and lead Russia investigator at Bellingcat, a fact-checking and open source intelligence site that has pushed the frontiers of journalism in so many ways. Bellingcat, as you well know, began as the Brown Moses blog run by Elliot Higgins as an investigation into the use of weapons in the Syrian civil war. And it's become a site where militarized spaces are mapped out, understood, and turned into stories about what's happening on the ground. Its reports on the war in Donbass, including the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, the Elgin Quito raid, the Yemeni civil war, and the Skripal poisoning, have changed the world and changed journalism. Christo himself has won awards for his work in identifying the suspects in the 2018 Skripal poisonings in Salisbury that linked senior Russian officials, linking senior Russian officials to the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 in 2014, Russian intelligence involvement in the 2016 Montenegro coup plot, and more recently, the poisoning of Alexei Navalny in 2020. Christo, thank you so much for joining us today. It's an incredibly busy week for you, Would you like to tell us a little bit what you've been doing in the last week? And then I'll open it straight out to questions after that.
Sure. I'll probably start somewhat earlier than last week because we've been watching this war come around in slow motion and not being sure how to report on it for almost a year. So this boils down to this specificity of what Bellingcat is and what it isn't. It is not a traditional news outlet. It's not a media outlet that can report on sourced information, source-based information. We don't do that. Sometimes we feel bad we can't do that, but we've taken that path and we count on data. Why we don't like to use sources? Because sources have agendas. Sources information is often valuable, but you need to net it out of the agenda of the noise and find the valuable information. And there are way too many quality other media that do that, so we don't do that. So, but because of the high profile we've received through our investigations, that were always data driven, we've also become a sort of a go-to place for some whistleblowers or some double agents pretending to be whistleblowers. So we receive a lot of data from Russian sources, including from Russian Siloviks, or the term that is used for the FSB/GRU, or whoever belongs to the militarized elite in Russia. So it's almost a year ago we received some credible sounding information that things will change in Russia this year, 2022, that it will be like nothing we've seen before, that Russia will become a dictatorship, there will be North Korea 2.0, that journalists will be jailed and free media, or the remaining on the islands of free media, will be shut down. And that the country will become an army, or it will be run like an army. This is exactly verbatim the descriptions we got. That was valuable insight. Of course, we couldn't validate that, but it was context. It was something that allowed us to watch out for what data would prove or disprove in the future. More recently, it was December when another whistleblower, again a Silovik source, told us that war with Ukraine is on the agenda. Told us that Putin had decided and had boasted to his small circle of loyalists that he was going to start a war in Ukraine, and that he was going to actually consider using tactical nuclear weapons, and that this had actually frightened everybody around him, except for a very small militarized elite that he trusted. That he had stopped trusting the larger elite, the economic elite that are traditionally his buddies and childhood friends, and he only trusted a few really corrupt, militarized gung-ho nutcases. Again, this was a source. We couldn't use that, but it allowed us to, or it scared us, and it forced us to look for the data that would support or disprove this. And the data started coming. It started coming in January, February of this year when we saw the aggregation of large armed forces units around the border, when we saw the movements of armed units from around the country to Ukraine under the guise of of exercises. And then we were sure that this is what it seems to be, and not just exercises, and not just a sort of a show of force, when Russia started lying about whether or not it was sending weapons to the border, and was saying that actually it was moving weapons to the border. So we saw all of this in slow motion, but it was all not much data, a lot of sources. And when the war was about to start, when the war was already pre-announced by the Biden administration, and who leaked a lot of information to other agencies, and media started publishing on the pending war, we decided that our first and foremost goal would be to try to prevent it, if possible, to prevent a casus belli, because it was clear that Russia preferred to start a war based on a plausible pretext. Nobody wants to start a war just because they're a bad guy. They would if they have to, but ideally it should look like somebody provoked them. So we focused initially our efforts in trying to find evidence as soon as something like a false flag operation or a provocation appeared to be spread by Russian state-run media that looked like it might provoke a global outcry, or it might justify the case for invasion. Our focus initially was to disprove that, or to prove it if that were to be the case, but to make it sort of clear for other media how to report on this particular incident when it's announced. Very soon the war started, and actually the war started without Russia being able to resort to such a casus belli, to such a false flag. There were many that we disproved, but none of them actually passed the muster test for Western media to believe in it, and to start reporting on it as if it happened. So Russia started the war without a casus belli, really. It was a really invented and fabricated casus belli that few people outside of Russia believed. But then we had to switch the resources from trying to prevent it to trying to archive it, to try to find evidence of war crimes. That's what we do. That's what we've done in previous wars, and validate them, because there will be a lot of propaganda on each side of any war. And this is a very, very special war. And we'll talk about why it's special. It's like nothing we've seen before. But we switched our resources to trying to archive, validate, prove, disprove war crimes and human rights violations. A lot of this work is not visible. A lot of this work will end up in courts in the future. And it might seem to a lot of people who are familiar with the sort of public-facing side of Bellingcat, all of our investigations, that we're doing very little. That's not true. We're doing a lot that is below the surface. We are archiving every single incident, reported incident of a war crime, of illegal munition or unacceptable munitions being used unacceptably. All of that is getting into a proper archiving system that we've unfortunately had the chance to develop in previous wars. And of course, part of that, and I'm finishing with that, part of what we do does end up in the public domain in real time, because there's a lot of propaganda on each side now, and Russia is trying to launder its activities by creating fakeries and forgeries and blaming human rights violations on their side, such as destroying a cultural and administrative center with human civilian damages in Kharkiv 2 days ago, and blaming it arrogantly on a Ukrainian provocation. So obviously we have to focus on that, because hopefully what we publish with hard evidence trickles down to a Russian audience that is more and more restricted from the Western world of information. But we're trying to simplify this data, make it believable, make it visual, so that even somebody who's not inclined and biased towards believing the, I don't want to call it the Western narrative, but it's like the normal narrative in this war, is going to likely be convinced. So mostly archiving war crimes, validating and disproving them, a little bit trying to prevent the war from continuing by exposing Russian claims about provocations on the Ukrainian side, about lack of civilian casualties, And one thing, last thing that we do reluctantly, but we have to do it, is we're counting and trying to validate the casualties on the Russian side, because according to official reports, the casualties on the Russian side are next to nothing. They stopped saying they're nothing yesterday, but they're still saying they're next to nothing. And they're not, they're in the thousands. And trying to validate that and trickle that information to the Russian mothers and fathers and sisters is just one way to stop the war sooner. So that's what we're doing, and I would like to answer any question that might come up in this conversation.
Thank you, Christo. There are lots and lots of questions. I'm just going to start with picking up on 2 points you made about hoping that this information trickles down to Russian audiences that are getting their access to independent journalism ever more restricted, literally by the hour sometimes. Can you just talk a little bit about the mechanisms through which you think this information will get to the kind of Russian population? And kind of related to that question from Ted Sullivan, which you've touched on, but perhaps you'd expand on, is, how do you think that the work you're doing could help to turn the tide of the war?
It's getting more and more difficult to pass the information to Russian audiences. You would never have a country, especially a country that has been in Russia's circumstances of governance, where the majority of the people actively seek out news. In Russia, the majority of the people are waiting for the news to be delivered to them. That's how they grew up. That's how they've learned from their parents, because of a long tradition of socialist centralized planning, and before in the Russian case even. So before you had at least a diversification of internet sources, where a lot of the people who are not actively looking for the news would see a diversity of opinion. They would end up on Twitter for entertainment, and they would see some reporting from independent sources trickle into their timeline. The same with Facebook, and the same with TikTok. What we have now is Twitter essentially having disappeared. I mean, it's next to impossible to get on Twitter in Russia, except for some operators in some regions of the country. But my friends in the deep middle of Russia, in the sort of mid-Russia and eastern Russia, are just unable for 5 days to access Twitter. They can't get into Facebook. Facebook has been throttled. And they're essentially defaulting to VK, which is the Russian equivalent of Facebook. And that is completely penetrated by a psychological operations campaign run by the FSB, where essentially every second post is a planted post, which debunks the world's view on the war and plants the exact opposite. So it's getting more and more difficult, and the only way to bypass this is through opinion leaders. And fortunately, that minority of the people that seek out information, they know how to get it. They know how to use VPNs. They know how to access information and critically evaluate it for themselves. And the only thing we can do now is push onto them the importance of talking to more people, of spreading the information to more people, and to not give up when the first relative, when the first uncle says this is bullshit. We know the truth because we saw it on television. And that's where the messaging from me and from us has gone in the last few days. And yeah, sorry, there was the second part of the question, which I kind of didn't.
How do you think this can help turn the tide of the war, or if you think it can?
I almost answered that the only way that this war becomes unacceptable to the large majority of Russians is if two things are achieved. First, the large majority of the population understands that civilian casualties in Ukraine are happening at a rate that is not collateral damage, at a rate that is not acceptable, and whether or not that is a sought effect or it's the result of an incompetent army, it is reality. So this would be an unacceptable price for the Russian population to pay. Even more unacceptable would be the home price, the price of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, any thousand number of casualties of their soldiers. So these are two pieces of information that, if delivered to Russian population, to the passive side of Russian population, will make a difference, will put pressure, maybe not directly on Putin, but on the people around Putin to stop the war.
Thank you. Again, I'll come to you, Laura, in a minute, but just want to follow up from this. Ukraine Pravda had a leak of the kind of details of Russian soldiers that I think is still being verified. I just wondered if you had thoughts on the significance and the kind of whether that can be verified in any other way.
Well, yes, it can. It's a war. It's only the fifth or sixth day of the war, and we have to allocate resources. And we think that at this point, the most important thing with our small team, relatively small team, is archiving war crimes for the near future. But validating the people who are, I mean, it's outing the people who are fighting there against their own wish because they're conscripts or contracted soldiers that are 19 or 20 years old is not what I would like to do. Proving that some of them have been killed is something I would like us to do, and we are trying to use volunteers for that, and others are doing it as well. But yes, a lot of lists, a lot of leaks are floating around. I mean, this is one of the things that makes this war different than anything else, is the digitalization of the war, and the fact that because of much of it is digital and the information part of it is completely digital, it has equalized essentially the sovereign states who previously owned the propaganda machine to non-sovereign states like Bellingcat, or to real biased parties on each side who actually have the capabilities, the sophistication, and the data to either put out the truth or to put out a disguised truth. So it is a very difficult war from an abundance of information and misinformation for anybody to figure it out. And that makes, even for journalists, but that makes the role of journalists 1,000 times more important than in previous wars, when you only had a binary choice of this is one piece of propaganda, it's issued by this government, and this another piece of propaganda issued by the defending government. Now we're talking about multi-vector propaganda messaging coming from bad actors on one side and from good actors, but also putting out fakeries on the other side. So you have to really, as journalists, we have to be the gatekeepers and to simplify it for the audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Laura, I'm going to into the room now.
Thank you for being here. I'm Laura from Colombia. I have two questions for you. The first one is, what do you think about the European Union censorship of Russia Today on Sputnik? Would you call it censorship? And the second one is, how do you think the conflict can be desescalated, at least from journalism?
The last question, how the conflict can, sorry?
De-escalate. I'll just kind of repeat those two questions, if that's okay. What do you think about the European Union's censorship or blocking of Russia Today and Sputnik? Would you call it censorship? And how do you think the conflict can be de-escalated by journalists, by the media? Which again relates a little bit to what we were talking about.
Yeah. Generally, we don't like the fact that the European Union is giving Russia an even more false equivalence reason to ban everything else in Russia. We understand the logic, we understand the guttural, instinctive wish to block misinformation, and that is clear misinformation. There's no question about that. That is coming from Russia Today and Sputnik. But in a way, they're talking they're preaching to the choir. They're preaching to people who already believe. I mean, anybody would go to at this time to sort of garner information from Sputnik and Russia Today, they're lost. So therefore, blocking them is not really achieving any outcome other than giving Russia the false equivalence argument to block the BBC, to block Deutsche Welle, which they did, and to block Spiegel, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that's a fair thing. How to de-escalate? Well, it's exactly these two messages. I mean, try to prove to the people who are the sovereign in Russia that this war is really costing them, that it's really costing them an insurmountable and unquantifiable economic future. I'll share one thing. I was attending a couple of months ago, when none of this seemed realistic. I was attending a secret get-together of the Russian independent journalists who decided to meet and think about how to deal with the dictatorial situation in Russia, outside of Russia. It happened somewhere in Europe. And I attended that meeting, and at the end of the meeting, one of the journalists said, we're all great talking about what's wrong in the country here, but we have to understand that not a single person in Russia is going to give up 10% of their economic welfare in order to achieve 80% more freedom. They're not going to do that. And what is happening now is actually, it's not 10%, it's 80% of their economic welfare will be gone. And therefore, they will start thinking, is it worth it to be deprived of freedom when I'm not getting the comfort that I was promised? So actually exposing the cost of the war to the Russian audiences is in any way is de-escalation.
Thanks very much. And I'm going to go to Hannah in Norway, because I think suddenly the Scandinavian countries are on the edge of a new front line.
Interesting. Hi, thank you so much for being here. I have two questions, if that's all right. The first question is, with the tsunami of information that's available right now, it seems like we know everything, but of course we don't. So I'm wondering, what are the unknowns about the war effort that you're most curious and looking to know right now? Then the second question is, do you think anybody at this point has good sources about what's happening in the Kremlin? Or is everybody just interpreting from public appearances?
Yes. I got the second question perfectly, and the first one, if you could rephrase it, please, or repeat it from the studio.
What are the unknowns in this information space at the moment? What information do you feel is missing?
Sure. And now I'm talking not as Bellingcat, the open source researcher, but as the analyst that has some idea what's happening, but it's different from Bellingcat. I'll put another hat here. What is clear to me was that the plan did not go to plan. The war has not gone to plan. The plan was for a blitzkrieg war, which would have delivered Kiev within a day or maximum 2, maximum 3. This was based on false information about the quality of the Russian army. This was based probably on starting the war somewhat earlier than was planned. This may have been a forced hand by the Biden leaked information, which called Russia not completely prepared for the war. But it has not gone to plan, and there's no easy plan B at the moment. It's clear now that Russia cannot occupy the country, that they cannot decapitate the country and quickly replace it with a proxy Muppet government that will have some degree of plausibility anywhere in Ukraine or in the world. It is clear that the population is not easily scared and easily succumbing to the threats as they thought it would. So that plan is gone. And what is unknown here is what's plan B. And it seems to me that plan B is being written at the moment, and they don't know what it is. And the fact that it's already taking 2 days, that a long column is getting just longer, but it's not moving, a convoy of weapons, may be an indication of the plan not being written yet. So that's the biggest unknown, what they will do. Another big unknown is we've seen, sadly, that Russia has, or the Kremlin has, internalized the reputation cost completely. So they've decided that they are the bad actor. They don't care about how they're perceived. And the example to this was the shelling of the most Russianized city in Ukraine, which was Kharkiv, because everybody there speaks Russian and they like Russia and so on and so forth. And they shelled it, and they shelled it indiscriminately, and they killed dozens of people. So it seems like they've given up the idea of rationalizing what they're doing, and they just want to terrorize Ukraine into submission. So the problem is that a jump from that to using nuclear is not unthinkable anymore. So that's another unknown. Are they crazy? The people of the Kremlin, are they crazy enough to say, well, let's at least show force if we can't show success? So these are the unknowns, really. Nobody knows really whether the Ukrainian show of resilience and agility and ingenuity is going to deliver a deflection of the attack that's going to win them the war. Most likely not, but it looks like it's a tie at the moment. So that's another unknown. How long can Ukraine sustain and keep the big towns out of Russian reach until Russia runs out of the logistical supplies, of the inventory, and of the money to run the war, which is another 10 or 2 weeks, 10 days or 2 weeks. It's not an insurmountable number of days. So these are all unknowns. To answer your second question very quickly, again, I'll have to default to sources here, and sources say that people around Putin are freaking out and they're thinking how to minimize the damage to themselves. And that does include thinking about how to get rid of him. So, and it's natural. It is not something that that we haven't seen before in history. It doesn't have to be a conspiracy theory. It's the natural inclination of the oligarchs who brought Putin to power and are now suddenly threatened completely. Their livelihood, their existence is threatened by his anti-pragmatic behavior.
Thank you very much, which again kind of goes back to the efficacy of sanctions.
Exactly. I mean, the sanctions, what media, we as media should do, we should think ahead of what the trickle-down effect of the sanctions is going to be so that we can explain it. And the trickle-down effect is huge. Think only about, for example, the fact that there are millions of Russian tourists or business people stranded outside of Russia, and they can't go back to Russia at the moment because of, because of the sanctions, because of the airspace being closed. Now, this alone creates social pressure, social tension in Russia. And it's a trickle-down effect of sanctions. But there's so many such trickle-down effects that need to be investigated and publicized.
Thank you. I'm just going to go back to you kind of the thing you mentioned about the nuclear threat, and Morten, I think, just wanted to ask a bit further about that.
Hello, I'm Morten from Copenhagen, Denmark. How do you assess the nuclear threat at this point?
We, as analysts sitting in the West, we assess it as a crazy thing to do. It's never going to happen. What I'm afraid of is that people close to Putin assess it as realistic. That's what I'm really afraid of. And they know him better than we do. And we're trying to analyze it, his behavior based on prior behaviors of other self-interested leaders. What if he's not self-interested? What if we don't know what's in his head? What if it is really, what if he's ill and he doesn't care what will happen? The only thing I'm alerting you is that people close to him believe that nuclear is an option that he's considering. But there's no way, it's unknowable. It's knowable through data. And the only thing that was a hint in that direction was his statement 2 days ago. But let's keep our eyes open. It's not crazy.
Thanks very much. Can I go back to the kind of the journalism and a question from Rowan Phillip in the audience about, could you talk a little bit about, say, the most important or useful databases and tools you're using at the moment?
This is another thing that this war has changed. At first, we've used most of our investigations to be based on leaked data or in open source data. Leaked data in Russia, there's a lot of databases of registered addresses of people in Moscow, car registrations with the phone numbers and car numbers and addresses. And a lot of these databases have allowed us in the past to pinpoint search of data to a particular subgroup. For example, military people who are registered to particular military addresses, or FSB people who have parked their cars near Lubyanka 1 or Lubyanka 2. So we have, from the past, accumulated a lot of data on the most likely people involved in a clandestine preparation for a war and then in managing the war after that. So this is a very useful core that we are able now to track sometimes, and I'm not going to spill all the beans here, but track their communications, track their movements, and see when there's chatter, when there's a lot of surge of communication, that means either something is being planned or something went wrong, and you use it to, then you use the public data to try to find out the explanation of what you see as data surges. But what has changed now is that there's an almost unmanageable new inflow of such information because of all the hackers, the ethical hackers. We have the Belarusian cyber partisans who were able, they created themselves out of the revolution in Belarus in 2020, and they are now not only able to disable the railroad system of Belarus and to prevent them from helping the Russian aggression, but they're actually leaking out to journalists who are interested information about all the military officers in Belarus who are now being engaged in the war. So there's an abundance of new available data. Anonymous, they hacked and leaked about 120,000 names, emails, and telephone numbers of active Russian military officers. All of that is available for anybody who wants to spend half an hour looking for it. It's really what you make of it that can make a difference. And trust me, we are only able, as Bellingcat, to instrumentalize 3 or 4% of that data. So it's open season for everybody.
Thank you. And that's kind of going to Meraj's question about casualties. How are you counting them?
Hi, I was wondering, you said earlier that Russia is saying that their casualties are next to none, but they're in thousands. So I'm wondering how you came up with that figure.
There are two different approaches that we and our colleagues from the consortium of open source investigators are using. The conflict intelligence team is a Russian outlet that only focuses on war crimes and war activities. They're doing a bottom-up approach where they're counting essentially verified open source data of dead bodies and of burnt out tanks and of the almost hard evidence of dead Russian soldiers. And they're getting to, or at least as of yesterday, they were getting to a number that was about 700 to 900. And it's lower than the number that I'm quoting because I'm using a slightly different approach. I'm trying to validate the number. I'm trying to validate the number of actual destroyed weaponry, of tanks, of airplanes, of armed transport vehicles, and then use that to come to an analytical number of how many people were there at the minimum before the destruction. And that takes us to a couple of thousand, 3,000 as of yesterday. But I'll be honest, we stopped counting because the focus now is on war crimes, and I wish and I hope somebody is taking that count as a priority, because it is important, but we just can't do it. We don't have enough people.
Thank you. Can I ask about the war crimes documentation, and could you talk a little bit more about what you're doing and exactly what you're documenting, and what will you do with this data? Will it then be presented somewhere, or will it be then released via media outlets? What's the game plan?
Yes, we've created a consortium with several media and also non-media, but organizations with experience in archiving information for war crimes from the past. It's a 5-party group, and we invite, well, on one hand, we have automated data collection bots that look for any TikTok, Twitter, or other social media evidence of explosions, of hits, where there seems to be residential or other buildings hit, and therefore there's likely to be civilian casualties. We then deduplicate all of this humongous archive of data we're getting. We've put out an appeal on Twitter to anybody who sees something that looks like there may be a war crime to send it to us. So first step is deduplication. Second step is geolocation and verification and chronolocation, which is also important because a lot of the data that is out there in social media is actual war crimes, but it's not from now. It's from other conflicts, and it's from the 2014, 2015. So we have to chronolocate the event to be sure that it's from the current war. And then obviously the next step is trying to find conclusive evidence that it's the Russian side or the Ukrainian side, as the case may be, that is the originator of the crime. And to do that, we have to look for the smallest of piece of evidence, such as the angle on which the crater is slanted in one direction or another, and then trying to geolocate the exact crater, put it on a compass, and then to see what the angle of approach of the missile would have been, and essentially creating a reverse ballistical analysis to see from where it would have come. In 2014, 15, and 16, we did a lot of that is out there published. It has gone to courts already. So you can see what we will publish in the future by going and seeing what we did in the past. For example, our analysis of the Mariupol shelling of 2015, where we proved that it came from Russia, and all of that has been handed over to the ICC. And this, let me answer to the second part of the question. All of this will go to whoever needs it, and the ICC and ICJ are the obvious recipients. But what we see is more countries being open to use universal jurisdiction this time than in any previous conflicts we've seen, to litigate and prosecute the war crimes on their territory. So it might not be just The Hague, it might be Germany, it might be the Netherlands, and so it may be multiple jurisdictions that prosecute this. We're just preserving the data, validating it, and we'll make it available to anybody who needs it.
You talked about propaganda on both sides, and I just want to kind of talk a little bit more about this and firstly, what propaganda are you seeing from the West, from Ukraine? And then in terms of verification, how much time and how able are you to verify what's coming out of the Ukrainian sides? And then there's a question related to that from Knut Johan Faretsveit in the audience about there don't seem to be as many photos and videos of Ukrainian troops as there are of Russian troops, and why might that be?
Well, it's the answer to that is obvious. You have a friendly population to the Ukrainian army, and they would not willingly post TikToks and videos of their army movements because this will provide too much valuable information to the enemy. It's to be expected. It's a natural cost of waging a war in a hostile environment, as the Russians decided to do, and maybe ill-advisedly because they thought it would not be a hostile environment. So that's the answer, simple answer to that question. And in terms of what kind of propaganda we observe from the Ukrainian side, it's different than the Russian one. They don't need to fabricate evidence of war crimes because apparently it's there. And it's there in abundance. So the propaganda there is actually demotivators. They call it demotivators. They're trying to create and exaggerate the losses and demotivation of the Russian army. So that's where we are looking for evidence of such propaganda. I'll give one example. There was an alleged email that was sent by an FSB officer that in the early days of the war that described a terrible state of affairs on the Russian war front and a terrible despair at the Kremlin about how the war is going. And this became viral, and a lot of journalists actually believed that it was an actual FSB officer. As it turned out, we looked into that and we found, first of all, that the language and the sort of the vocabulary didn't match with what we knew was the FSB way of writing. And then we found out that it was actually Ukrainian propaganda that was pretty good because a lot of people believed it. So that's an example. It's something unavoidable and something that you should be, you don't need to justify it, but you can put it in context. I mean, they're trying to prevent an invasion, and that's why they do that. I mean, today, I just before this call, I almost fell for, I always assume the worst. So I assumed that something that I saw was a Ukrainian grandfather talking to camera for about 3 minutes about how he was walking with a shovel and talking to camera about how he's going to dig trenches because he cannot afford for his 3-year-old green-eyed granddaughter to be killed by Putin. And he was addressing Putin directly. And I thought, this is such a slick Ukrainian propaganda thing. And then I decided to look him up. So I did a face search for this guy. And actually I found him on VK, on the Russian social media account, with his son and with his granddaughter. So he's a real guy. But I assumed it's Western propaganda, it's Ukrainian propaganda, because it looks so slick. But again, what we're seeing now is non-sovereign actors achieving almost the quality of influence, of importance, of relevance to this war as sovereign actors. And we have to be open-eyed about this.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, some of the videos have been so slick that you kind of raise the question, were they pre-prepared? Were they pre-recorded? Are they actors? And it's, yeah, I mean, yeah.
And many of them are, but
yes.
Just we shouldn't assume all of them are, because my daughter can make a much slicker video than a professional director could do 20 years ago. So that's.
Yeah. Thank you. Guillermo, back in the room.
Hi, I'm Guillermo from Uruguay. You said that journalism is especially important in this war. What do you think about the media coverage of the war so far?
So the question is, what do you think of the media coverage of the war?
In the first days, I saw something that in European coverage that looked like false equivalence, and it was really dangerous. It was many media outlets reporting on both claims, on both sides, as if they were equivalent in value. We saw a lot of that in Italy. We saw all of that in Bulgaria, in Hungary, in countries that are generally trying to be understanding of the Russian side for economic or other reasons as well. We saw some of that in the more unexpected countries, like in Ireland and even in some Nordic countries, but then went away. So I'm at this point. I really I cannot criticize media for the way they're covering the war. Before the war started, there was this major blunder that I think a lot of media outlets allowed themselves to be dragged into. It was clearly a psychological operation by the Biden administration to put out a specific day and a specific plan of attack and a specific plan that they had seen as the only plan. And media covered that as the gospel. They said that is the date, it's the 16th, and it's 4 in the morning. And the problem is that, yes, I could understand why you couldn't sit on that information if it looks credible and comes from a credible source. But you have to understand that you're putting your name out there, and for many reasons it might not happen. And you can be the reason why it doesn't happen like that, because a pre-announced war is likely to be a deferred war or a changed war. So you're essentially announcing something that may have been true yesterday, but it's no longer going to be true after you announce it. So a lot of media jumped into that mistake of discrediting themselves by captioning all caps announcements of the time and date of start of the war. But at this moment, I think the media is doing a very, very thorough job.
I'm going to relate this question from Shaprova, who's a journalist from Bangladesh, who asks, do you think there's a risk that journalists are kind of glorifying the war and militarization, reporting on the civilian armed resistance? And the kind of flip side of that is, what happens when this armed resistance fails, as it inevitably will in certain cases? You can't withstand this giant army forever on all fronts. And, you know, what are the dangers of the media almost then giving a sense that Ukrainian civilians have failed in their defense?
It's a very, very good question, and I don't even dare to begin to give moral advice on that. I think each of us should make some very hard choices before we start covering the war. One is, where does your bias stretch to? There's definitely going to be bias, but does it stretch to just being anti-war, which is an easy bias for most people to accept? Does it stretch to being anti-war and anti-civilian damages? And if that's the only bias, then you might actually start thinking about whether you want to encourage civilian defense, civilian offense, because this is likely to cause more damages. It might actually punish the Russians, but it might result in more damages. Maybe your bias is that you're anti-dictatorship, and then the civilian cost is acceptable. We all need to make these choices before we start covering, and then I don't know what the right answer is, but everybody would live with and already with the awareness of why they're covering it this way, and the cost, it will be accepted to them.
Thank you, Prova. Good question. I'm going to go back to the audience, the online audience, and there's someone who's remaining anonymous, but would you be able to comment on the cyber escalation of the conflict? Firstly, where do you see the key risks? And again, what's the most effective way for journalists, do you think, to cover this, document this?
Well, this is the most cyber space war that we've ever seen. We're still learning, and I don't think we've seen the big cyber escalation yet. We do see examples of, well, we published last week an article where we had identified a whole depository of fake cloned websites of government offices in Ukraine that had been prepared by Russia for deployment at some point in time. They haven't been deployed. Maybe they will never be deployed because, again, this war is being rewritten. The plan is being rewritten, and we don't know how it's being rewritten. But there was going to be essentially a cloning of the Ukrainian official internet with virus-laden clones of these websites. So that's an example of what could happen. And suddenly you think that you're going to the president's site of the president of Ukraine, and it will not be that. We see a counteroffensive at the moment where a lot of hackers are destroying Russian infrastructure, cyber infrastructure. We see anonymous hackers claiming that they've taken down the Russian Cosmos communication with Russian spy satellites, and then you see that the Russian space centers, space agencies saying that that's fake. Now, if that were to be true, and we haven't yet looked into that, but I'm sure others have, but if that were to be true, this would be a major cyber impediment to Russia to continue the war as it wants to. And what we're seeing is the counter to cyber is interesting as well. Apparently, because of the mobilization of the global non-sovereign cyber actors in this case, and the threat that it poses to Russia, Russia has decided to move to analog communication as much as possible in order to prevent digital communication from being hacked. And what we're seeing now, the downside of that is thousands and thousands of intercepted phone calls between Russian military officers and soldiers. That is in the analog. That is, it's the same technology as American police cars that you can listen to on a scanner, and you can listen to how Russian officers are complaining about not getting food, not getting water, not getting enough air support. Some of them are crying on camera, on audio. So this is again an unforeseeable result of the cyber escalation. It's being written, so I can't tell you what the next escalation will be, but it's something that is extremely fascinating, and you should watch for a new level of this cyber game on a daily basis.
Thank you. And then the other aspect of this war is the kind of something we saw in Syria as well, people traveling to the region to fight, and kind of armed militias, vigilantes. What intelligence do you have? What's your sense of where they're coming from, what their numbers are, and if they're going to have any kind of, if there's any significance in their presence?
Well, I mean, you have the volunteers. Let's talk on each side. So first, there's the official Russian army. Call them what you want, but they are abiding by some military rules of engagement that are much better for civilian protection than what we had in Donbass, where most of the offenders were actually mercenaries or volunteers that were run by GRU or FSB commanders. So the majority of the people deployed by Russia are Russian soldiers. What is really scary is the desire by the mercenaries, by the Wagners of this world, to also get a part of the game. And yesterday we saw an actual recruitment ad by Wagner, the original Prigozhin-run organization, which literally said, "We want to be part of the world tour." And Wagner, because they call themselves the orchestra, is hiring new fiddle players, new violinists for the new concert. So it was an open recruitment of mercenaries. Now these are people that are not abiding to any rules of engagement. So that will be something to watch out for in the next stage. And they're willing to apparently jump into the niche that is opened by the lack of success of the official army to show that they can do it better. And that is scary. On the Western side, you have volunteers that are just joining the army. You have, of course, you will have the occasional vigilantes. But what we have now is a huge wannabe army from Europe, from the world, that wants to go there and fight, mostly on the Ukrainian side, some of them on the Russian side. And I think the smartest thing that Ukraine could do is what they're doing now. They're trying to formalize that into a foreign legion so that there is some system of rules of engagement being imposed on these people, as opposed to these people just going on tourist visas and started buying a gun locally and started fighting. So there will be a harsh control on the Ukrainian side, hopefully, on who gets to fight.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm going to go back to the room to Robin.
Hi, yeah, I'm Robin from the UK. I wondered, so much of the work that you guys have done at Bellingcat is based around tech that kind of has only become available over the last 10 years and even more recently.
specifically data gathering and verification tools, which you've kind of developed and pioneered. To what extent do you think journalists covering conflict and totalitarian regimes are in a better position than you were historically? Or is it just a case of kind of keeping up with bad actors, increasingly sophisticated bad actors?
Yeah.
Well, in our own case, we've seen this as a multi-layer computer game where we win one level and then we teach the bad actor how to upgrade themselves. I'll share a secret. I probably not use specifics, but yesterday I was exposed to a bad actor who's under arrest now, where they found in his computer a report on an article that I had written about an assassination in Europe, or an assassination attempt in Europe. And this bad actor had analyzed my report and had come up with a list of suggestions for improvement of the assassination next time around. So essentially, what we do, while it exposes a lot of the bad actors' activities, they actively use it as training manuals for improvement for next time. So the transparency that we've sought in the past, it also serves to make them more sophisticated. And to come back closer to your particular question, it's true in the way they make more sophisticated efforts to disguise data, to hide data, or to poison data. I mean, hiding data is the best, from our perspective, is the best thing they should do, because we have old versions of databases. When we get new versions of databases and we see missing people or missing addresses, we know that's the interesting part because they decided to delete it. But they learned from that because we used this trick a few times. So now they're trying to poison data. They just change a little bit the name, they change a little bit the photograph to make it difficult to orient oneself. So it's a multi-layer game. They improve themselves. But there's always a way around it. And again, with what is happening now, at least in this conflict, we're getting the support of so many new allies, the hackers that we didn't use before, the hackers that previously were doing things, hacking for money, the hackers that actually had hacked us before because they received money from the FSB are now leaking to us because they see that this is an evil war. So I think the downside of being too transparent is being offset by the increasing number of allies who are willing to help us get data.
Thanks very much. Thank you. And we're going to go, because the idea of poisoning the data and again, creating misinformation, question from Paula in Chile.
Hello, my name is Paula Molina. I'm from Chile, and I would like to ask you about this decision to act preventively against disinformation, warning about these false narratives or so-called fake news, instead of ignoring them or underestimating them, or even worse, underestimating the audience. So I would like to ask you if you think this has been partially successful or successful so far, and which lessons can we get from this, we as journalists?
It's always a hard choice. For me, it has been a hard choice because I've seen a false narrative come about, and I know that if I start commenting on it, first of all, it will give it prominence, more people will pay attention, and there's a lot of people, especially in in non-free societies, to whom it is difficult to accept that their governments are evil. It's just not a natural thing to accept. So the moment I expose it to both sides of the story to them, many of them will be more likely to buy into the official narrative, which is the misinformation narrative. So that's one reason to avoid it. But it's always difficult. It's tempting to address it head on and to say, come on, this is obviously fake. And this is where it's leading you. The other problem is what we discussed a bit earlier. You may know what's going to happen, and you may in certain conditions prefer to let it happen because if you publish the information beforehand, it will it will teach them, it will train them. And again, this is not what journalists should do, but when there's a war at stake, it's so difficult to be only a journalist. And sometimes you, again, as I said, you decide where your boundaries are, and then you act accordingly. But I don't have the answer to you. For me, it's every day, it's a question: do I do this or do I do that? And I've made wrong choices. I'll give you an example. I mean, there was a lot of intelligence information last week that there were 3 columns of tanks approaching the Kiev, the capital, Kiev, and that in total there were more than 400 tanks. And this was valid information. We saw objectively that the tanks were there, and everybody in Kiev, the government, was freaking out. The tanks are coming, they're coming, they're coming. Please tell the world they're coming. And I was wondering whether it's the right thing to say or to post it or not. And I did tweet. I said, there's intel evidence that tanks are coming. And the tanks stopped, so they didn't arrive. And it kind of provided an attack angle to people to discredit the information, saying, well, you see, the tanks didn't show up there. In the same way that a lot of people are saying the times were wrong when they said the war will start on the 16th. So it's a choice, it's a risky choice, and I don't have the answer.
Thanks very much. I'll come to Gideon in a moment, but I just want to go back to the audience and some questions about Russia and the kind of, again, what's happening on the ground in Russia. A question from Yang Zhang, who's asking, well, interested in the implications of the crisis on Russian civil society. You mentioned the role of KOL in spreading the, information, misinformation. How do you see this playing out? Is there going to be increased censorship? What's kind of midterm influence here?
Right. The warning we received last year was that the full dictatorship would occur about March of this year. It's apparently happening earlier. Makes you wonder if the Biden administration misled us all by saying that the war is starting in February. Maybe it was meant for March, and maybe he just forced Russia's hand. Interesting question. But what was already known back then was that there was going to be a lot of dissent within even the elite, that there was preparations going on back then among the Siloviks, among the power structures, who don't want to be living in a North Korea 2.1. So there was already some thinking, which had never existed before, about something like a coup, something like a disobedience within the Silovik structures. Now, this is going to be accelerated manifold because of the incompetent way that the war is being waged, because of the huge cost, unprecedented cost. And again, we've been talking, I've mentioned non-sovereign actors many times today, but the non-sovereign actors that joined the sanction game are probably much more important to cause civil unrest in Russia than the sovereign actors. Apple banning the sale of iPhones in Russia is going to have 100 times bigger effect on the Russians' perception of the importance of sanctions and their loss than SWIFT being disabled for Russian banks. And this is happening. Netflix is saying they're not going to broadcast Russian channels, which means they'll be banned out of Russia. Netflix local partner in Russia is a company run by Putin's lover. No, Netflix is already taking a side here. And so on and so forth. Just try to see the fallen effect of all of these non-sovereign sanctions. Russia will be a different society in 2 weeks than now. They're a bit shell-shocked. They don't see what's happening. They can't feel it. They still have old iPhones, but it will happen. It will strike home to them. And the one thing that was a smart thing that Putin invented in 2000 and ran with it until now was the understanding that he doesn't need to control all of the media in order to control Russia. He needed to control just enough to have the passive part of the population sort of brainwashed. And he understood that he needs to have an island of free media in order for the intelligentsia, for the elite to have a go-to place so they don't explode, so that there is a safety valve. They closed those media in the last month, and specifically yesterday, the last remnants, TV Rain and Echo, were closed. This means it's an explosive situation. It's not going to be tolerated. And even these these journalists who until today, until they were closed on these remaining media, were trying to be polite to the state. They're no longer polite. They're calling it as it is. This is a completely different Russia than last week.
I'm going to, I know I was going to come to you, but actually, sorry, I'm going to go to relate to this, just to jump to the audience. Question from Gritty Balats, which is, how do you think international organizations can best help Russian language independent media covering the Ukrainian war, both in the immediate and also the long term? You know, what type of support is useful and what is not useful?
There are specific ways in which the global monopolists of internet infrastructure can help. Google could introduce specific algorithms that would prevent blocking of websites that are run on their servers. I know that our Russian partner, The Insider, a very brave Russian publication, has been lobbying for Google to implement this new technology, and Google has been sitting on its hands. So international organizations can lobby actually for the giants to implement such ways to disable the blocking of content for Russian citizens. More differently, I mean, organizations can actually help by offering opinion leaders in Russia and bloggers refugee status and asylum in order for them to have at least an exit option or safety, that if they speak their truth, speak their mind, they will have a place to go to. Maybe give them a place now so they can be speaking from the comfort of a free country. So there are many things that can be done, but all of them are linked to bypassing censorship and giving courage to people who have the truth but are maybe afraid of speaking it.
Yeah, I think that seems the perfect moment to end this. And I'm sorry there are so many questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them, but it's been an incredible hour, really vitally important, life-changing, I think, for many of us. Krista, thank you so much for your time, and we wish you all the very best with the work.
Thank you so much.
And thinking of everybody risking everything out there, and yeah, just thinking of you and doing what we can, which is not very much at the moment, but we really are. Thank you, Krista.
Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you.
The audiences as well.